The name of the book is Fixing the Climate by Charles Sable and David Victor. And Charles Sable is from Columbia University. He's in their climate sciences program. So first, I thought tonight we just kind of refresh our memory and review what is this term experimentalism and governance, and then move into new material, why we need international cooperation, and that could use experimentalism. So focusing on the Paris Agreement, which is our current international treaty or convention of all the nations in the world, minus a few, including the US, and using that as a way to revise it, revamp it, and bring experimentalism into it. So that's what I want to talk about. Then last, I'll end with, what can we as individuals do? And if we have time, we'll move into this little add-on, which is, what are these new agreements that are in our international community that are called open plurilateral agreements, and how they work for the World Trade Organization? And then that means they might work in the climate regime, the global climate regime. So that's where we're going tonight. And then I mentioned that I've been talking to a couple folks about this presentation and what we want to teach and what we want to think about. And one of the things that I was reminded of is that we need to tell the truth when we're talking about how tough things are right now with respect to climate change, global warming, and all of the attendant potential catastrophic things that could happen by 2050 or by 2100. And we need to really focus on the truth. And I thought about this quote from Wangari Maathai, who is the late Wangari Maathai, and she won the Nobel Prize, and she worked in a difficult place in Africa. But I like this quote because it reminds me of some of the difficulties that we have, and why I'm focusing on experimentalism and governance internationally, all the way from our city, all the way to international bodies at the UN, because this is what's going on. When you have bad governance, you got problems. And the deeper and deeper she got into it, she saw how those issues were linked to governance, how illegal logging and destroying the forest. She was really big about reforesting her community. And that Greenbelt movement has really taken off now. And so, yes, we need to teach the truth. And this is part of the truth, that we have to pay attention to how we are governed. And there's other truths. I was at Costco the other day, and I just love shopping there, to be honest. And sometimes I get nice T-shirts there, right? And I was really picky. I'm really picky when I go there and look at their clothes, and they have wonderful clothes. But I decided I will not buy anything at Costco unless it's 100% cotton. Okay, great. Yeah. So then I kind of got in this mode of, oh, look, that's 100% cotton. I think I'll buy that. Not knowing if I really need it or want it, or is it really, the right thing to do today. Not thinking about my carbon footprint when I'm making the purchase. So there I am at Costco. There's the T-shirts. And I was like, that is so cute. I love that. It's made in Bangladesh. It's 100% cotton. Oh, gosh. And then I just checked myself. I was like, I didn't come here for T-shirts. I came for milk, So I was like, yay. I was proud of myself. I resisted the pull of consumerism. But that's something that is alive and well in the country, consumerism. And, I identify myself as a hypocrite there, and it's really hard. Of course, I want to have a nice vehicle. Do I really need a new vehicle right now? No, probably not, but I want to get an electric one. When is my time? So unfortunately, a lot of people in America, we think that business as usual is going to be okay now. We've got a message from our government, right now in this current White House that all we have to do is adapt. And, so what if it goes to 3 degrees? When I was here a few weeks ago, I explained where that 3 degrees Celsius limit is coming from. It's coming from this DICE model, from these climate economists who are saying, hey, it's all right. We can live with 3 degrees. Why can we live with 3 degrees? And why is it all right? And why is our White House listening to these folks? Because business as usual will be all right. We can adapt. We can have our big cars. So let's be truthful. That's not what the Paris Accord is all about. That's not what climate change is all about. We came to an agreement, and I'm going to review what that agreement is, the Paris Accord. 2 degrees Celsius, that's it. We should aim for 1.5 Celsius because we care about future generations. We care about the poorest of the poor, right? I mean, that's why we're people of faith in this room and online. So let's promote development that will not destroy our environment. So let's do a quick review. If you remember our our experimentalist governance theory, it's decentralized. It has all people participate. We have to include civil society in these decisions. So when we in the United States are accustomed to sending comments to our elected officials, and a lot of us are doing that right now, that's not necessarily true around the world. So it's important that we make sure that civil society gets to participate in these big international conferences where, the climate glitterati get to come together every year. And part of experimentalism is making sure everybody's there, including industry. Everybody has to be at the table. We certainly have seen industry at some of the latest conference of the parties of the United Nations. So the oil industry is there. A couple of years ago, the meeting was in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, with a lot of influence from the oil industry. But anyway, these are some of the key features on this slide. I won't read them all. I'll just go over the topics. Generally, you have to have these really broad goals. You don't start out knowing where you're going to end up because it's so much uncertainty. So in some ways, we're pretty cool with the Paris Agreement goal of 2 degrees Celsius. There could be other goals that could be broadly stated that we could work with. And I'll try to talk about that in a little bit. You have to have a lot of discretion to the members of your agreement, to the cities, the states, the countries. People need to be told there's some flexibility in how they're going to reach the goals. And there's some things like that in the Paris Agreement. But one of the things that's not in the Paris Agreement is the idea of peer review. And that's a feature of experimentalist government. You have to have really good measures of progress. You have to have indicators and measurements. How are you getting there? Now, in the Paris Accord, they have nationally determined contributions. Voluntary, they're not enforceable by any international body. And those are not necessarily being met. And there's not a very good reporting mechanism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. And then you need to periodically revise your goals, even the procedures that you have. As you are governing, you need to look back at your rules and how. So that's just kind of the basics of what I'm talking about. And I have one more slide on this. A couple more things about experimentalism and governance. You need to have some incentives. And that's really hard when you're talking about international community because it's the community of nations, so that the only real leverage one nation has over another is the pariah state. So I pulled this off of the source World Data Info with these current pariah states, supposedly Russia, just for example. But even there, not to be offensive with their world data source, they're going to say, well, this may or may not be accurate or reliable. You know, who is a pariah? Some people will argue to right now, Israel's a pariah because of what's going on in Gaza. You know, could they be nominated and could they be ostracized from the community of nations? And what's the penalty besides ostracizing and shaming? And you know, who has slaves? Nobody has slaves anymore. But if somebody started a slave colony, we would shame them. We would ostracize them. Apartheid in South Africa, they were in big trouble for a while, right? So there is something to the fact that the community of nations can kind of shame another country into doing something. But you know what really makes a difference, of course, was when there were financial consequences. So that penalty default, you know, you to make it have power when someone's not cooperating with the community of nations, you need to have some kind of incentive. And mostly what you get in this arena, like with the Paris Accord, a Paris Agreement, or with the climate change regime, is exclusion from the marketplace. So, you know, our current administration in this country is excluding people from the marketplace by jacking up their cost of doing business here. Of course, we pay the tariffs, but we're not going to order as many things from those countries that have high tariffs. Of course, we pay them. That makes them more expensive. So a tariff is not really an example of a penalty default, but exclusion from the marketplace is. So I think that I just have one more thing to share here. This is another key feature of experimentalism and governance. And this is why I said those participants need to include a wide variety of people. So, because you have to have deliberation. And when we met last time, I used a little local example in Seattle. There were some food inspectors, and they used the deliberation method and the peer review method to improve the inspection services at their county health department, so that they had two inspectors go out together and they had them come back, and then the supervisor would review what they were doing. So this idea of deliberation is really important. And even in that little example from Seattle, when those inspectors came back and they had questions, they went and talked to the experts who wrote this manual of what is a safe restaurant. Well, how do I know what this new food is that they're serving here and what are the requirements? So the experts were there to help those peer-to-peer encounters. But the thing is, when you have high uncertainty, like we have in climate change, we don't know exactly what all the solutions are. We know a lot of solutions, but we don't know them all. Then you have more need, a greater need for deliberation. And so that's part of I mean, you can see on the slide, I don't want to read it to you. Oh yeah, and the other thing is experts may or may not be decision makers. You may want them on your decision-making team, but you don't have to. But another entity you do want in these participants is you definitely want some lay people with their experience. So, and that might include industry people. So the other aspect is once you plug in this whole theory of experimentalism and governance into a regulatory body, which is like the EPA where I used to work, you have to tweak it a little bit in order to get the full benefit of experimentalism and governance. And so we went through a big rigmarole at EPA back in the 1990s with regard to acid rain and how to control SO2 from these coal-fired power plants and other sources, and how to control that effectively meant force new technology to get the SO2 out of the emission, to collect it before it could escape the smokestack. And then what happened, EPA and industry got together and invented scrubbers. And the Office of Research and Development at EPA and different industry experts, and they formed a committee, and it was very much an experimentalist governance in a regulatory format where we had a lot of uncertainty. Nobody knew how in the heck to get SO2 out of those smokestacks, but they created the scrubber. And it's in the electrical plant that's run on coal, there's all kinds of issues. You have baghouse dust, you have the chemistry of getting that SO2 out. You have the idea of an engineer that has to run the turbine that gets the water, that makes the steam, that makes the electricity. Then you got to have an electrical engineer. And so all these different scientific and engineering experts have to come together to make one coal-fired power plant work. And adding on a new thing, a scrubber, when they already had to do baghouse dust, was really hard, but they figured it out. And then by the time that moved along, the innovation was there. The government passed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 and created a market so that people could buy these expensive scrubbers and put them on their power plant and reduce their SO2. And other people who couldn't afford yet to get a scrubber could trade credits. So everybody would get allowance. You can pollute this much SO2. Cap and trade was instituted, a market system. And so that's what this book talks about. It goes in great detail about the scrubber example, because it's a perfect example of how you can regulate with both sides of the powers that be. You can have your command and control and get those scrubbers installed. Then you can go out, once you kind of know where you're heading and you get a technology that starts to work, you can go out and start using the marketplace and do a cap and trade on SO2. And the people that can afford it will buy the scrubbers right away. The others may buy credits so they can keep emitting SO2. So once you know what you're doing a little bit more, and you know your goals and you know some of the tools, then you can use both the marketplace and a command and control. What's happening and going wrong, I think, with the Paris Agreement, they just started out with the marketplace. They've just been doing so much marketplace with the old Kyoto Protocol. And there was so much confusion and fraud and mismanagement of the marketplace. It wasn't working. And that led impetus to the Paris Agreement. Hey, this marketplace isn't working. And it did try to combine, some command and control with not voluntary emission limits, under the Kyoto Protocol. It was like, you will meet your targets. But it wasn't well known how to attack it. So Kyoto failed. But in a successful experimentalist governance, you really do, and you really can. It's best when you can use both. So that's enough review, unless somebody has a question online or otherwise. Probably more review than you wanted.
In wildlife management, there's a thought process of adaptive management.
Yes.
Did they acknowledge it's pretty similar kind of approach.
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Yeah.
This semester, one of my graduate students wrote a whole paper on adaptive management for vegetation, endangered plant species, and he focused on coastal species. And it is a great example of use. This is my student in this class, and we're talking experimentalist governments. And he said, I want to write a paper on adaptive management, which means you can take a plant that's like in my paper and my student's paper, growing by the coastline. Climate change is coming. Sea level is rising. You want to protect an endangered or threatened plant. You just move it. It's really quite tricky, though. It doesn't sound near as easy. And you try to find a place where it can live elsewhere. So you're managing to adapt to climate change. And you're trying to save a species. You move it up to higher ground, maybe move it to a whole new zone, because the northern hemisphere is getting warmer. So some of the plants can move farther north because it's just one zone warmer. And they've had some success moving a few plants to Canada, I think. And mostly it's been done with not plants, with animals,
Yeah, well,
wildlife.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, sure.
So the other thing I want to kind of focus on is why this international cooperation is so important. Because we talked a little bit, and I wanted to spend a whole lot of time on all the great things that cities do. I mentioned last time I was here how Prairie Village is working on its climate action plan. Kansas City has a climate action plan, and all those things are very effective. There's some new studies right now that say cities are making a difference. And the biggest difference it makes, the cities that are having success in drawing down their emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, it's simply by taking stock, by analyzing and reporting to the community. This is our emissions. Do an emissions inventory and keep that in front of the community, all of your industries, all of your city facility managers. Let them know, hey, this is your CO2. That is more effective than hiring a sustainability manager for many cities. So there's some new studies that are saying how important it is just to keep the information, the transparency. What are we doing? Are we reducing? Is it going down? Is it going up? Where are we emitting the most? So don't have time to focus on that. Instead, I really want to focus on why we can't rely on those simple efforts. And they're wonderful. They're a little bit more simple when you think of just attacking the issue at the local level. But why do we need global cooperation? So that's what I want to talk about next. And there is an easy way. You'd think, again, maybe the community of nations could just come together and say, oh, let's just phase out fossil fuels over the next 20 years. They could have said that 10 years ago. Instead, I mentioned before, the real climate overarching goal of Paris is instead, there's this 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. And that's a term of art in the, climate community. Pre-industrial levels would be before like 1850, right? So we know that that's not going to happen. Like we could wish that would happen, but just for an example, why is that not going to happen? The Conference of the Parties of the Climate Glitterati, as I like to call them, was in Dubai in 2023, oil producing country. And it was great, some of the things they accomplished, but what did they say? And got great applause around the world for saying, oh, let's increase renewables by a factor of 3 around the world. Everybody who's Paris Agreement, everybody in this agreement, let's go 3 times more renewables. And 2 times, let's double our energy efficiency. And here's the kicker. Let's phase down unabated coal power. I mean, that is just so nuanced. What does that mean? Phase down unabated coal power. It's a mealy mouth political. Okay, so maybe they're going to try some more carbon capture and sequestration. Second, when they did finally say phase out fossil fuel subsidies, they said subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies they want to phase out. Not all of them, just the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I don't know if you remember last time I was here in 2024. Oh, I may have the wrong year because I don't have it in front of me. 23 or 24, the world spent $1 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. So which are the inefficient ones? Okay, so I'm sorry, but I don't see us coming up with a hard and fast goal of everyone agreeing to phase out fossil fuels even in 20 years. So I like to think we live in the second best world. You probably heard that expression before. at least in my sphere, when I was negotiating and you're trying to get, a settlement with a controversial situation or a conflict or a lawsuit, and you're trying to settle it, and you always have your top settlement position, and I'm not so sure you're going to get that, so you have your second best. Your second best, and then you have your bottom line, and you always hope to get to a win-win where everybody can at least get their second best. I know that sounds horrible, but that's the truth. Everybody kind of throws out the high ball, right? I mean, just think about buying a car. So because of these pressures, these worldly pressures, and maybe because of greed and carelessness, it's just we're not able to do that right now. So what else can we do? And I go, let's begin with a phase out, some kind of phase out. So maybe this one year isn't too bad. Maybe in COP30 coming up in Brazil, they can work on this and make it better. The phase out language, draw down greenhouse gases, just kind of do things that we're doing. Because one of my teachers says, whatever the problem is, community is the answer. And I think that community means community of nations and community right here in Prairie Village, community right there in your home, in your neighborhood, your HOA. So this is another reason why I think it's really difficult, this chore. It's a lot of uncertainty and it's a difficult situation. And there's a lot of pressure for us in our complicated global situation. I got to see some whales this year for the first time in my life. It was really fun. And that was just in December. And it reminded me of this situation. I like to share this cartoon with my students a lot. It's a little bit hard to see. I can't seem to get rid of that thing, but it's not in the way. That's just a citation to where I got this picture. But I think it's hysterical. And what this whole article talks about back in 2017 is the tragedy of the commons, right? And well, there's a lot of paradox in there too. I'll get to that, but this, you can't quite see it maybe, but these are a bunch of whales having a celebration in the early 20th century or late 19th century, and they're celebrating the discovery of electricity and the idea that, hey, no one will hunt us anymore for our whale oil because people won't need whale oil anymore because they'll use methane gas for lighting their lamps, and there'll be electricity. And so we've been saved. The oil wells of our native land, may they be forever, and all these happy days, the whales. But the truth is, after the whale oil would have been, no longer necessary, the whaling companies went bonkers and, just got as many whales as they could because of the paradox, the depletion. They were like, well, we're going to go out of business. We got to get all the whales we can possibly get right now and sell as much whale oil as we can sell right now. And they nearly went extinct at that time because of the pressure from what they call the depletion paradox, where it was overexploited because they were closer and closer to the end of their life, of their business life, of selling oil. So I think there's a lesson here for us, that we're not in an indigenous situation where Mother Earth will provide for our need, but not our greed. The indigenous people knew this. They knew this, but we're in a different enlightenment period. And we think that many of our some of our faith traditions have taught us that humans have dominion over the land and the earth, and this dominion gave us this authority to use these resources. But this other way of looking at the world is a community way. that Mother Earth provides for our need. And so
Yeah.
that's part of the problem here is that
Uh-huh.
we cannot expect the oil producing nations to just roll up and go away. They're not going to. They're fighting it right now. You know, they see the renewable energy coming down in kilowatt per hour cost, and they're fighting it as hard as they can. The power companies don't even want you to own your own solar panels, stuff like that. So I could go on about that. So now I just want to switch gears because when you look at the Montreal Protocol that protects the ozone layer, it is the best example we have of an international agreement that utilizes experimentalist governance. And so these chemistry professors figured out that there was a connection between the chlorine gases that are made up to help us with our refrigeration and our air conditioning and our fire suppression. And those gases were released into the stratosphere, causing a hole in the ozone, which allowed ultraviolet light to come in, causing more cancer and more cataracts. They discovered this in 1974. We got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for that. And what happened then is one of the best examples we have of the international community coming together and acting in this way, in this manner that we would like to see the climate change regime come in. And they instituted a ban. I mean, not just a phase out of fossil fuels. They went right away and they said, what's going on with these ozone depleting substances? We're going to ban them. And it was not immediately ratified by every country in the world. No, no, no. Only 24 countries came up at the beginning and said, yeah, we're going to do this. And eventually all the member states joined. So, but it is the world's first treaty that had every member state of the United Nations join. It's a very strong commitment. And it has those penalty defaults that I was talking about, so that you try to get away with selling Freon on the black market and the rest of the world finds out about it, you can be sanctioned. People won't buy your Freon or your other products. And it has a wonderful amendment process that works really well. It helps a whole lot to be able to amend and adjust these international agreements because you need that flexibility as you're experimenting with how to ban these substances. So this is just a little graphic in case if you're not that familiar with the ozone hole problem. A lot of people hear ozone and they think that ground level, which causes asthma, and it's the same molecule, three molecules of oxygen. And but what we're talking about is about 10 miles up in the stratosphere, and it's a protective layer. And if we don't have it, ultraviolet comes in and just will burn everything up, basically. So it's really a powerful reaction chemistry wise, because they figured out just one atom of chlorine in these gases can remove 100,000 molecules of ozone, the protective ozone that we need. So the world listened to the scientists. And that's just a picture of the ozone hole most recently. And it's kind of hard to see with the lights on here, but you can see almost the whole of Antarctica is open to the ultraviolet light. And one of the other key features, which is really essential, if we could get the Paris Agreement and the climate regime to adopt this in an appropriate manner, is what we call common but differentiated responsibilities. The Paris Accord, I'll show you in a minute, has a um, a version of common but differentiated responsibilities, but that's in its overarching treaty that the Paris Agreement is part of, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the Paris Agreement is not real clear on this common but differentiated responsibilities. Kyoto Protocol was very, very rigid about these responsibilities, but again, it failed and didn't work. So I don't want to spend time on that. But how it works is you can see this top chart shows how all these different chemicals that make ozone depleting substances are being phased out over time. And that's what the protocol calls Article 5 countries. But you can see down here, that's the developing countries. So they don't have a lot of money. They're poor countries. They don't have a lot of air conditioning. They don't have a lot of cars, but they do have some and they want more. So they are given a lot more time to phase these things out. Whereas the non-Article 5 countries are developed already, which includes the US, the timeline is much more rigid. And on the top, just for the sake of discussion and, just to kind of give you the general idea, that shows a bunch of different types of ozone depleting substances, CFCs, HCFCs, halogens, HCFC, and the bottom one is a chart that just shows the HCFC. But you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but by 2015, production was frozen in all the developed countries like the US. In 2020, no new equipment was even made. So much faster phase out. These were some of the reasons why this was such an exemplary treaty and why it's working so well. Way back at the beginning, which was around 1985, 10 years after those scientists discovered the ozone, there was no ozone hole discovered in 1974 and 75. They just discovered the chemical process. 10 years later, we get, in 1987, we get those scientists to help negotiate the treaty. The participants were all there, the experts, the industry that produced those substances, the refrigeration industry, the air conditioning industry, the fire suppression industry. Everyone comes together in their various sectors and works on the problem. And they create technical options committees to provide that expert guidance. Then they go out and try different solutions and they compare it around the world. Then as those solutions are revealed, oh, this one worked, this one didn't work, this is failure, an iterative process. You have a review of all the experiments by a technical economic assessment panel. Those two groups, the options and the review panel, they report to the members of the treaty or the Montreal Protocol. And that's how decisions are made. Experts don't always make the decisions, but their decisions are relied upon. And so it helps innovation, and then it can be prioritized by sector. So the slide that I showed you before had a lot of different types of ozone depleting substances with different dates of phasing out. So that applies to different sectors. One of the sectors that was very difficult early on was refrigeration and foam blowing. So they were given a longer time. People that made those products, those gases, and utilized those products in their equipment were given a much longer time to phase them out because more innovation is needed to find replacement gases. And in fact, right now, over at KU in the main campus, there's a brand new facility called EARTA laboratory, and it is doing all kind of research on refrigeration gases under this regime, to get rid of ozone depleting substances. One of the things that happened was when they created an option, a new substance, they found out, oh yeah, it's not going to disrupt the ozone layer, but it will cause climate warming. So that's what happened with the refrigeration gas, and that's why they're working harder to get that. And then, what are some of the successes? Here in the US, it became part of our climate change, or excuse me, part of our Clean Air Act. I was mentioning how we amended the Clean Air Act in 1990 to add an acid rain cap and trade program. Also in 1990, they created this amendment to the Clean Air Act to phase out these ozone depleting substances by domestic law. So that's the kind of commitment you need to have a successful international treaty. You not only want the domestic nations and the member nations to ratify, to accept and become a member, you want them to ratify the treaty, and the important thing, make it part of their domestic law. So then you have an enforceable component. You have a real command and control. And that's what happened in 1990 with the Montreal Protocol. And EPA was then able to plug in and become part of those technical teams and help other countries around the world develop different equipment, different gases to provide their technical expertise. So having it be part of domestic law is really important. And it continues to work. In 2020, the Congress and President then signed into a new law about these ozone depleting substances that are being researched right over at KU right now for refrigeration. And so now that's part of our domestic law. We're going to phase out those refrigerant gases, and we're doing the research, and it's going to take time and it takes flexibility. And that was done under what was called the Kigali Amendment to the protocol. But look at the results. This is old data, and I'm sure it's better now. But the reason I put these results there is because if you notice, it talks about people born between 1985 and 2100. They will have reduced incidence of cataract. So this work that we've been doing as a body of nations is for the future, is to protect our children in the future against these, cancer and cataracts, and it saves money. So, we who benefited from air conditioning being invented in our lifetime, or me at least because of my age, are helping with this national law and this international treaty protect future generations, because it's our responsibility.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember also learning that the ozone depletion also endangered the pollinators, and that would affect our food supply immensely. Is that true?
Well, it's probably the UV, the ultraviolet light coming through, and what they have found now, I don't have time to get into it, but the latest thinking and studies have shown that because of the success of the Montreal Protocol and this drawdown of that repairing the layer of ozone that protects us from UV, we've actually enhanced the ability of plants to do more photosynthesis and become healthier and absorb more CO2. So the Montreal Protocol didn't intend to help with global warming, but it actually did in a measurable way. So I'm sure that it would also protect the pollinators too, just like it protects, having that layer there protects our eyes. So the other thing, I might just skip this. Oh yeah, this. So there's one more thing that's just essential for any kind of international coordination to work. You have to have transparency. I mean, we want it in our domestic governments too. We don't want corruption. We don't want people hiding things. We want to know what's going on with our tax dollars, with our programs that we're supporting. we need transparency, we need monitoring and compliance. So all the countries that joined this Montreal Protocol agreed to monitoring and compliance. And so there has to be a mechanism so you can kind of police around the world who's making these gases, who's making these ozone depleting gases, and who's going to do the policing. And so just by way of example, we need the same kind of monitoring and compliance with our greenhouse gases and our greenhouse gas reduction goals. We don't have this. We don't have this kind of policing. We don't have this kind of monitoring and compliance. But because of this action that happened back in 2018, 19, and 2022, when they found these ozone depleting substances in the atmosphere, and they're like, well, where's this coming from? These things are supposed to be phased out. We should have much greater success, with the phase out. But how did they do this? Well, they put these monitoring stations out there, and who are they? Does anybody want to guess who doing the monitoring? The good old USA, NOAA. NOAA's doing this. So this is important stuff, and NOAA puts these monitoring stations like, oh my gosh, this stuff is in the air and it's screwing us up. We're going to be 10 years behind on our goals to repair the stratospheric ozone layer because these people in China and in the Western Asia and two more places, which I'll show you here in a second, are screwing around. So it's not just China, but it's maybe India and in Indonesia, people are screwing around. So what happens next? The community of nations gets together and say, hey, you guys are screwing up. Where's your stock taking? Where's your report, China? Let's see what you're doing about it. China steps up. Here's what we're doing. And we know what they did, and they stopped it. They found those rogues, gas producers that were selling little canisters of Freon around the world, under the table. When I first started my career at EPA, we had a whole branch in our office that would do investigations trying to find the people that were selling the Freon under the market to automobile repair places. So, or venting, somebody's at the landfill, right? And they take all their white goods, their old refrigerators, their old air conditioners, and they would try to dispose of them. There's a rule. You don't just vent that old gas up in the air. You have to capture that gas. That was another thing that EPA was doing in the beginning of this. I don't even know they have to do that anymore. People are caught onto it. So this is the kind of stuff that we need in our climate regime. This is why it's successful. This is why we're getting rid of that ozone hole and repairing our layer. So if I haven't confused you enough, with all the amendments to the Montreal Protocol and all the different kinds of gases and the different sectors and, foam blowing, fire suppression, this term is appropriate. You should be a little bit like, wow, this is really complicated. They didn't even know there was an ozone hole when they started down this line, this treaty. They're like, well, this looks pretty bad. We're destroying this layer. And then eventually they took pictures and they found the ozone hole. Now we know it's being repaired. So it is what they call an international mega regime complex, a complex regime. And it's a perfect example of sectoral experiment. Not perfect, not at all. Nothing's perfect, but it's a good example. And it has a couple of things that are really good. It's non-hierarchical and consensus is not required. Every time that the folks get together under the Paris Agreement and they want to make a decision once a year, they have to have consensus of every single party. And that causes all kind of watering down to the lowest common denominator of any kind of statement about climate. So this was one of the unusual international treaties because remember when I said not everybody joined up at the beginning? Only 24 countries joined at the beginning back in 1987. They created a system of rules where they could change the agreement, minor adjustments here and there, extend time out, give one sector some more leeway to create a new gas by majority. And there were some minority rights. So there's a lot of thinking that in experimental governance, you can't make it work with consensus. But you do need some kind of democracy, which that will be the rules for making your decisions. I think in the interest of time, I'll just scoot along here. So, yeah, coming down here to the wire. This is the last part of my talk. So, like I said, we got this one great example consistent with an idea of experimental governance, mega regime. Now we got another mega regime, not consistent with experimentalist governance. And just, to step back for just a second, why monkey with it? We threw the Kyoto Protocol out under one of our other presidents. Why don't we just throw this Paris thing out? It has some good things to it. We don't want to lose it. It is the climate consciousness of the planet. And maybe that's not such a bad overarching goal, 2 degrees Celsius. We need some more broader goals. We need something a little more concrete that we can attach penalty defaults, and we can measure and say, well, you're not making it. The voluntary, nationally determined contributions, nobody's, they're not really living up to those. And then we have this other thing that people are making changes anyway. I think one of our other speakers said, oh, if only China and the US could get together and do a good trade deal. It wouldn't matter necessarily what the rest of the world was doing, because we could make a really good trade deal. And in the trade deal, we could talk about renewable energy, and we could reduce our fossil fuels, and just the 2 biggest emitters could come together and have a bilateral agreement on how they're going to reduce their greenhouse gases. And it could go a long way to solving our problem. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of too much competition between the US and China. These tariffs, they're just not going that way. And mainly it's not going to happen because of the United States. China is going full steam ahead. You can see from this chart, they're leveraging clean tech for their own geopolitical gain. US withdraws from Paris Agreement. We're even talking about withdrawing from the overarching United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been around since 1972. So, and this one's really hard to believe. They are proposing that they no longer have an emissions inventory for the United States. We've had emissions inventory since 1990. So, if we stop doing that, how are we going to be able to compare with our historical missions? What we're doing in 2026, 27, 28. We're just going to have a big gap. So, yeah, this is it. This is a very complicated, long-term regime that's been going on really since 1950s. It was the 1950s when the World Meteorological Organization was first put together. We had concerns about climate. And then they had their World Climate Conference, 1979. We had this Brundtland Commission report about the environment, about the Montreal Protocol on ozone. That came out. You can see the history here. I'm not going to read it all for you, but you can see It's a complex meta regime. And I'm reminded of this whole thing about chain and tipping points. And you can see in this list, if you wanted to, you can put these dates on this little graphic and imagine it as a tipping point in a system. In this regime, there have been tipping points. So we had the scientific inquiry era from 57 to 79. We were in that valley. We got ourselves up out of the valley and up to that little ridge, and we tipped over into a whole new framework. And that was called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That happened in 1992. And that was international political action of significance. Having that, and we are a part of that. Every country in the world is a part of that framework. Out of that came the Kyoto Protocol. Finally, after so many years, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the international community of nations got together, created the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Declaration. That, hey, Copenhagen Declaration, we're going to help fund a climate fund that will help poor countries. So all that happened in the next decade or two from being in that valley. And even the Kyoto Protocol Accord went all the way to 2012. And then as it had started to expire, people were like, Kyoto Protocol is not working. We got to do something different. Another tipping point. We had to get up over out of the Kyoto Accord Valley and move into the Paris Agreement. And that's kind of where we are today, even though the United States is not part of it. But it's really a tipping point in social governance that we can see as we move around these, these valleys and mountains that we have to climb in this very complicated regime. And the whole question is, what next? Where are we after 2024 with the United States not being in there? I don't have time to talk about it, but I think this is where we got to go. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the World Trade Organization. A lot of environmentalists don't like it that much, but it's also in a real deep valley right now. A lot of the World Trade Organization's mechanisms for resolving trade disputes are not functioning right now. They're called appellate bodies. They don't even exist. There's no people working in the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. So when you have your trade dispute on all these tariffs that our president has laid, you can take it to the World Trade Organization and go, oh yeah, thanks, we'll put it in the pile. When we get our appellate body back up to speed, maybe we can, give you a decision. And then there was a lot of resentment of the World Trade Organization as far as its power to try and force nations to abide by its decisions. But people are working on it, and they created these things called open plurilateral agreements. We're really out of time. I don't have time to share with you. That's where I think we have to go. Why? Because open plurilateral agreements, they're experimentalist governance. They work in the sector level. I shared one with you last time I was here, which was the I didn't share this one, but the International Maritime Organization has an open plurilateral agreement, basically, that they would have used a similar thing for world trade, but they're using it to help reduce emissions from this international shipping industry. And I shared with you last time about the aviation. They're working on it, and they are using experimentalist governance. It's a civil aviation international body, just like the Maritime Association. So I was going to go over, there's some specific things that will really make the Paris Agreement competitive in a sense that fair, like we want world trade to be fair, not, one country dumping on another or, subsidizing. So we also want to have fairness when it comes to our renewable energy, our various products that are coming out of this, the fund that needs to be managed, so that we can use funds that the developed rich countries will put together to help. There's a $1 billion donation, and it's a pledge. You don't have to live up to it, but we did. We, the United States, put $1 billion into that fund to help the poor countries with their technology for reducing their greenhouse gases. And that was under President Biden. Anyway, the two last Democrat presidents put in $2 billion altogether. We had originally pledged $6 billion, but with the new president, we're not likely to do any more. And other countries have pledged quite a bit to that fund. It's kind of that second best world, where at least we can have a fund to help the developing countries. And so, just back to us and what we can do. I showed you this last time, and this, I can make sure all these citations and links are available. So you can go on Catherine Hayhoe's Substack or her LinkedIn and get all these wonderful ideas. She's one of our preeminent climate scientists. She works for the Nature Conservancy. She's a professor. And I think some of you are probably familiar with her thoughts on what we should do with our money, with our schools, with the politicians. But here's another 2 articles. I know it's hard to see, but at the bottom of this slide, there's 2 links that you can go